Our next key concept is levels of measurement. Much like variables and hypotheses, levels of measurement is going to be part of the language of behavioral statistics that I really need you all to commit to memory, so to speak, right? Because as we move throughout this course, and I reference the concepts within levels of measurement, I want you to be able to know that when I use this language, this is what I'm referring to, and so on and so forth. So levels of measurement are really just helping to build that vocabulary that we want to have as we are continuing our semester. What is level of measurement? So level of measurement refers to the method we use to collect data for a variable. Recall that variables are characteristics of human behavior and that these characteristics differ from individual to individual. When we want to collect this information, we need to decide why we want to collect it, which ultimately affects how we collect it. If you've ever taken a survey, you're asked questions about certain pieces of information related to yourself. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point you've wondered to yourself, why are they even asking me this information? What does it have to do with blank? And let's say blank refers to, the bigger question that, the research is asking. When, as social scientists, when we ask questions, we want to make sure that we're asking questions that are appropriate, that are necessary to this thing that we're studying. And so when we ask those questions of ourselves as we're developing these tools to collect data, it's ultimately going to affect how we collect that kind of information. Levels of measurement are broken down into a total of four categories: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. For this class, we're going to combine interval and ratio variables into one category, which we'll refer to as interval/ratio. So we'll begin with nominal level of measurement. The nominal level of measurement involves names or labels. And these variables place individual characteristics into categories. So I'm going to give you some examples of this. So examples of nominal variables include gender. When we ask a question of gender or gender identity, we are going to provide individuals either the opportunity to include their own gender identity, or we are going to provide a predetermined series of gender identities that we would include. So this might include non-binary, man, woman, queer. There are, various identities that we could include in here. And so when we provide, again, either the categories for individuals to self-select into or the opportunity to write their or include their own gender identities, we are collecting this and we are collecting this data and we have these categories to work with. Ethnicity is another example of this. When we ask people about their ethnic identity or their ethnicity, we are collecting information that is based in categories. So people might say they are Kenyan. People might say they are Moroccan. People might say they are Maori, right? These are different ethnic identities. Political party affiliation, occupation title, relationship status. Each of these refer to categories. And these are distinct categories. These categories are not intended to overlap. And so when we are, developing our questions, we have to keep these kinds of considerations in mind. Our next level of measurement is ordinal level. So the ordinal level of measurement involves ordering or ranking. If a variable's options can be placed into an order or rank, it is ordinal. So some examples of ordinal levels of measurement include education class. So for example, in high school or in college, we have these different categories: freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Each of these are distinct and separate categories. However, they can be placed into some sort of order or rank. Rating how amazing your stats professor is, from amazing, neutral to this guy is awful. These are examples of categories, individual categories that can be ranked. Job satisfaction, very dissatisfied, dissatisfied, satisfied, very satisfied. Metal placement, bronze, silver, gold. Pain level, scale of 0, no pain, to 10, worst pain possible. These are all examples of ordinal levels of measurement. Ordinal variables allow us to clearly state one category as being higher or lower than another, but we can't necessarily state how much higher or how much lower, even with numerical scales. So what does this mean? If we're talking about the variable related to the rating of how amazing your stats professor is, if one person gives me a neutral, another person gives me an amazing, we don't know what the real distance between neutral and amazing is, right? We don't know, does the second person rating me as amazing, how much more amazing than neutral is this person claiming I am? And so in this case, while we can absolutely place these categories in order, we don't necessarily know what the distance is between them. Now, you might be wondering, okay, sure, that may make sense for the rating of how amazing your stats professor is, but how does this relate to something like pain level where we're using numbers? The difference here is almost a difference of use, based on how it is that we are collecting our information. But when it comes to something like pain level, we have to consider that one's person, level 10 pain is another person's level 8 pain, right? It's difficult to measure exact distance between something like pain level because of that difference in individual pain tolerance level. So even though someone may have a 10 versus someone else having an 8, it's really difficult to know just how much higher that 10 is than that 8. Now we'll discuss our interval ratio levels of measurement. So interval and ratio levels of measurement indicate ordering of categories and an exact distance between them. So examples of interval ratio variables include dollars or cents, right? You got $5, you got $10. There's an exact distance between those two values. The numbers of hours worked. 39 hours versus 40 hours. There's an exact difference between the number of hours worked. Scales of depression, GPA, standardized test scores, IQ scores. The scales of depression one, this may seem like it's a little bit more leaning on the pain scale. However, I included it here because it's important to note that when it comes to developing scales or rather when it comes to developing tools for measuring different ideas, there's a lot of work that goes into developing these tools. So when I describe scale of depression, know that I'm actually referencing that from the way therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists have developed the tools to measure these things to describe, some sort of exact distance. Some variables are naturally interval ratio variables, such as the number of siblings. If I ask you how many siblings you have and you say 0, then there's not really another there's not really a different way of answering that question, right? So that is naturally an interval ratio level. Okay, so while I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between interval and ratio variables, I did want to make sure to include the description of what the difference between them is. So, interval variables have a 0 point that is considered arbitrary. And when we describe something as arbitrary, we're saying that it kind of isn't really clear. It's not really evident why it is that 0 point exists the way it does. It sounds kind of odd, but let's take a look at this example. An IQ score of 0 does not mean no intelligence. Just as a score of 100, an IQ score of 100, is not necessarily twice as intelligent as 50. So, in the case of IQ scores, there's not really a truly meaningful 0 point. Similarly, in standardized test scores, a score of 900 isn't necessarily twice as good as a score of 450, and a 0 does not represent a complete absence of knowledge. So, interval variables have a 0 point that is arbitrary, it is not meaningful. Ratio variables have a meaningful 0 point. So, for example, a 6 foot person is twice as tall as a 3 foot person, and 0 represents no height. Similarly, someone earning $100,000 is earning 5 times as much as someone earning $20,000, and 0 represents no money. So the difference between interval and ratio variables is that interval variables have a 0 point that really doesn't mean anything, while ratio variables have a 0 point that does mean something.